الأحداث السابقة تتكرر دائما وبصورة تكاد تكون متطابقة، ليس هناك جديد على الأرض. إذا درسنا التاريخ وعرفنا أن حدثا ما قد مر قبل ذلك وكانت فيه نفس الظروف والملابسات التي تواكب حدثا نعيشه الآن، فإننا نستطيع ببساطة أن نستنتج النتائج.
In 1989, a report from the National Research Council published a statement that American society can be divided into two categories, the pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey eras. How could one man's influence come to define our culture and produce what some consider the most harmful book in American history?
It would find its way into every aspect of our decision-making in our lives.
Kinsey has legitimized the free sex revolution, and he did it through academia.
Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Despite his Christian upbringing, he would come to reject the Judeo-Christian belief of his family in favor of Darwinian philosophy, accepting the idea that man is simply a more highly evolved animal.
Kinsey, as a zoologist and biologist, considered, rightly, that humans are animals, although lots of people hate to admit that.
Dr. Judith Raisman is renowned for her expertise on the damaging influence of pornography. She has testified repeatedly before the U.S. Congress. Her research has been used by the FBI and by governments throughout the Western world when determining their policies on obscenity.
In Kinsey's view, a lot of sex crime was really not crime at all. He seemed to worship sexual experience. I mean, he had a 24/7 obsession with sex long before he attained the position at Indiana University. So for him, all forms of sexual experience, to one degree or another, could have merit that were outside the pale of traditional morality.
She is author of the book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, in which she details the devastating impact of Alfred Kinsey in America, an influence she believes is behind the growing number of sexual predators who seem to come from all walks of life.
The laws were changed based upon his fraudulent data, and he was directly involved in those changes.
When the Kinsey reports were published, they shocked the country, because the behavior that Kinsey described did not at all represent what most Americans believed about their own sexuality. Consider that Kinsey was documenting the behavior of the World War II era, those that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Through the 1930s and 40s, Alfred Kinsey conducted thousands of interviews with both men and women, taking, as he called it, their sexual histories. The purpose of his study was to discover the sexual behavior of the average man and woman in America at the time. Upon interviewing thousands of volunteer subjects, Kinsey not only recorded data, but drew certain conclusions about the sexual behavior of men, women, and children. But was his research that of an objective scientist, or the intentional manipulation of a sexual deviant who wanted to remake the American male and female in his own image? Among Kinsey's more controversial claims is the idea that 10% of American men were fully homosexual for at least 3 years of their life, while 37% of American men had engaged in homosexual contact to the point of orgasm at least once in their lives. Later studies would place those numbers much lower, with only 1% of men in the U.S. claiming to be homosexual, while only 2 to 3% admitted to some kind of homosexual activity in their lifetime. Kinsey also reported high levels of premarital sex, claiming that 69% of American men had visited prostitutes and that 50% of married men were guilty of adultery. Again, a later study done as early as 1960 by Phyllis and Eberhard Kronhausen would find that the levels of sexual promiscuity among males were much lower than Kinsey had reported. According to his fellow researchers, The reason for this dramatic difference is because Kinsey manipulated the data, including men from America's prisons, as part of the regular male population.
He wrote that he found 1,300 to 1,400 sex offenders that he used as his normal male population. What?
In addition to the convicted sex offenders, Kinsey included regular prisoners who were serving time for other offenses, along with 199 sexual psychopaths, all mixed together as part of the regular male population and presented to the American people as the average American male. In this interview for the documentary titled 1 in 10, listen as Paul Gephardt, who was one of Kinsey's co-authors and a member of his original team, admits to the high percentage of prisoners and their impact on Kinsey's data.
With these poorer, lower educational level samples. And when I say poorer, they had, for example, 55% were prison. 55% were prison. And I think that has a definite effect. We know we didn't have enough non-prison people to do much of a comparison, but he didn't do a comparison. He simply took the prison people he got and used them with that less than college educated sample. A lot of errors into the data.
With America's prison population presented as the average male, is it any wonder that laws would be changed to accommodate sexual predators while failing to protect women and children? To create high levels of homosexual activity, Kinsey also went into Chicago's underground, into gay bars and homosexual bathhouses, and incorporated the radically gay population into his regular male data, along with bootleggers, gamblers, male prostitutes, ne'er-do-wells, pimps, thieves, and hold-up men, all this according to his own report. Kinsey used similar tactics to redefine the average American female.
They use this picture all the time to try and show the American public that they were interviewing average American women, all right? Except that this was their secretary. Okay, this is a secretary at the Kinsey Institute, and they would always label her as though she was just some average American woman. Sometimes they put Kinsey in the picture interviewing her, and sometimes they put him. And now, after I exposed that in one of my books, the Kinsey Institute has now admitted on its website, they give the name of her, so it doesn't look as though they're trying to phony the thing.
To create high levels of female promiscuity among American wives, Kinsey redefined married women to include any woman that had lived with a man for at least a year, a broad description that could include prostitutes who had lived with their pimps. In fact, prostitutes were a subculture that Kinsey specifically sought out, mixing them in with the regular female population. As a result, Kinsey's report stated that some 50% of American women engaged in premarital sex, while 26% of married women were supposedly involved in adultery. Kinsey went on to report that an incredible 87% of unmarried women were having abortions, while 25% of married wives were also aborting. It was these high percentages, shocking even by today's standards, that would help to legalize abortion in the years that would follow. By far, the most disturbing evidence against the Kinsey reports is the information pertaining to the sexual behavior of children. But the most disturbing evidence comes from Kinsey's so-called scientific tables, wherein he describes the sexual responses of young children. The child sexual data was more fully exposed by Dr. Judith Raisman in the 1980s, who brought the even more disturbing allegation that Kinsey had trained multiple pedophiles to molest children while using stopwatches to record so-called scientific data.
This man, this Kinsey, had been responsible for the rapes and tortures of hundreds, actually it looks like thousands of children.
At the base of Table 31, Kinsey tells us that the data is based on actual observation of 317 males. Then on page 177 of the male volume, Kinsey writes, "Orgasm is in our records for a female babe of 4 months." But how would anyone recognize such a response in a young child? Kinsey wrote that among pre-adolescent boys and among younger females, orgasm is not so readily recognized, partly because of the lack of ejaculate.
And so I said, what did this man, this Kinsey, call an orgasm? Right, I mean, it's an obvious question, isn't it?
Kinsey wrote, "Some males suffer excruciating pain and may scream. The males in the present group, by which he meant pre-adolescent boys, become similarly hypersensitive before the arrival of actual orgasm, will fight away from the partner, and may make violent attempts to avoid climax, although," he said, "they derive definite pleasure from the situation." For Dr. Raisman, the obvious question was, where did Kinsey get such information?
The information all came from this one man who had been collecting this information in an extraordinarily methodical way throughout his life since about 1917.
His real name was Rex King, a man who kept written diaries in which he claimed to have molested more than 800 children. Like most pedophiles, King was never caught and never served a day in prison. The Kinsey Institute usually presents King as a man who simply kept meticulous records and mysteriously came into contact with Kinsey. Mr. Green had been personally trained by Kinsey's mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Something admitted by Paul Gephardt in the 1998 British documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles.
Kinsey was told about Green by his own mentor in sex research, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Dickinson had collaborated with the paedophile for several years and taught him how to record his child abuse in scientific detail.
He told him how to measure things and time things, and encouraged him to, he knew he was going to do his ordinary behavior anyway. Dickinson couldn't have stopped him from being a pedophile.
Oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
The letter that Dr. Raisman refers to was written by Paul Gephardt on March 11, 1981. According to Kinsey's interpretation, the children supposedly enjoyed the molestation while it occurred.
He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children. What American is going to defend that?
How does C.A.
I looked at those charts and graphs. I can't tell you how long it took me to try to process what I was seeing. I said, this is the torture of children.
Someone, 4-year-old, 26 orgasms in 24 hours. Tell me, Phil, does a baby sleep? Tell me, Phil, does a baby sleep? Tell me if this is scientific. A baby sleeps for 8 hours? You tell me how you get 26 orgasms for 24 hours.
Dr. Clarence Tripp, one of Kinsey's original team members, offered this comment on Green's molestation of children.
Well, here's this man with hundreds of contacts. There was never a charge against him. He was never arrested for anything. All the children thought he was wonderful. All the mothers thought he was wonderful. There are two, I suppose, lest you get contradicted, there are two instances in which a young boy or girl, I guess it was, I don't remember, didn't complain. They agreed to the sexual contact, but then they found it very painful and yelled out when it actually took place. This was because they were very young and had small genitalia, and Green was a grown man with enormous genitalia. And there was a fifth problem.
I assume, were they in prison at the time?
Oh, certainly not. But they were, in her sense, criminals because they were pedophiles. But they were trained
Oh, in her
trained
sense,
observers.
they were criminals because they were pedophiles. They're raping children and they're not criminals. You're going to defend
Nobody
that.
was raping children. What they
what
were
do you
doing...
call sexually, manually, and orally abusing a baby, and you're a bloody pedophile?
If we're talking here about science,